In this video, I will present a critical examination of Mill's utilitarianism. This video will offer a more detailed examination of Mill's treatment of utilitarianism and explore the reasoning behind it. For collectivists, morality and philosophy of life tend to be thought of together as the same, but individualists tend to have a collectivistic morality which stands in a problematic relationship to their individualistic philosophy of life. In his book Utilitarianism, J.S. Mill tends to present the word utilitarianism as the name of a moral principle. This, despite the claim of morality to universal application, raises the question of whether Mill is really discussing a principle which would fundamentally shape a person's life. However, he does on occasion express himself in a way which suggests that he is viewing utilitarianism as a philosophy of life. For example, on page 5, he calls utilitarianism a theory of life. One thing we ought to be concerned with, then, in reading Mill's book, is the role that Mill would like to see the utilitarian principle play. Also of concern are his interpretation of the utilitarian principle and his treatment of argumentation for and against utilitarianism. J.S. Mill claims to be a utilitarian, and his book is supposedly an explanation and a defense of utilitarianism. Yet Mill's biography shows him to have been a key player in the camp of the capitalists. Capitalist and pro-capitalist writers display a very favorable attitude towards him and his writings, the reading of which they have always greatly encouraged. Does Mill then assume, or even establish, that capitalism is an appropriate means to the utilitarian end? Or does he regulate utilitarianism to a peripheral role? Or does he sabotage utilitarianism by confusing the reader regarding its implications? In this video, it will be argued that Mill's book is in fact a pseudo-utilitarian work which is suited to integrating would-be utilitarians into a capitalist society, just as pseudo-socialist writings serve to integrate people of socialist leanings into a capitalist society. Examination of Chapter 1, General Remarks. Nothing fundamentally objectionable is said in this chapter, but a few points can be made to clarify, amplify, and slightly correct Mill's observations. The question concerning the sum hanun, or highest good, on page 1, is not really the same as the question concerning the foundation of morality. Mill is imagining that moral rules must be devised by a calculation that shows them to be appropriate for attaining that which ought to be intrinsically valued, or valued for its own sake as opposed to valued as a means towards achieving something else. However, many people acquire moral rules through unreflective processes of moral training. They may never even raise the question of the relationship of their moral rules to that which they intrinsically value, whether morally or otherwise. Those who originated the moral rules which are incalculated will have had various reasons for doing so. Precisely because values can be incalculated, as well as because of the innate differences among individuals, we should not be surprised at the perpetually controversial nature of value questions. Value judgments do not describe facts, they describe attitudes, feelings, and etc. As long as attitudes, feelings, and other things people find valuable differ from person to person, their value judgments will differ accordingly. If ice cream makes one person feel sick, but always delights another person, they will have no difficulty in agreeing on these two facts, but it will be impossible to get them both to say sincerely, "The ice cream is delicious." For the function of that sentence is not to describe any fact, but rather to express a reaction to the ice cream, a reaction that varies from person to person. Mill criticizes those who say that fundamental moral judgments are true by definition, or known by some sort of an observation, on the specific basis that they are unable to come up with an ordered set of specific principles. In this chapter, Mill does also criticize Kant for failing in his attempt to show that to deny certain fundamental moral judgments is to contradict oneself. Certainly, value judgments such as causing pain is bad do not seem to be true by definition in the way that bachelors are unmarried is. A judgment that is true by definition has its function in displaying of information about word meanings. Value judgments have quite a different function, and so it is not surprising that nobody has been able to analyze the meaning of the sentence, "causing pain is bad," in such a way as to show it to be true by definition. The same goes for other fundamental value judgments. However, it is just as wrong-headed to think in terms of verifying fundamental moral principles by some kind of observation, presumably involving some sixth sense. There is a reason why parents do not try to get a child to accept moral principles by trying to activate his or her powers of observation. Even if a child, or anyone else, agreed that he or she had observed the fact that it is allegedly reported by a moral judgment, this would still not settle the person's attitude, and until that is settled, the person has no value judgment to express. The person could say, I see everything that you see in the state of affairs which you call bad, but it would offend my conscience not to call it good. However, it does not follow from all this that we cannot argue rationally about value judgments, or that we cannot change our own or other people's minds about value questions by presenting reasons. One could argue, perhaps, that it is a matter of analytic truth that pain is bad by definition for the person who is experiencing it, and likewise that pleasure is good by definition. If two people disagree about whether a bowl of ice cream is good, we can sometimes change an opinion by introducing information which has that effect. For example, pointing out that the ice cream contained poisonous ingredients would possibly change the opinion of someone who had considered the ice cream to be good. Mill makes an important point on page 3 when he notes that we often use the utilitarian principle to justify adopting, modifying, or rejecting some other moral principle, which is then seen to be secondary or subsidiary. This is simply a matter of reasoning about a matter of extrinsic value on the basis of a principle which expresses an intrinsic value. But even an intrinsic value can give way, in reasoning, to another which is held to be more important. For example, a person might argue, I have been brought up to believe that eating pork is intrinsically wrong, but to prohibit the consumption of pork might lead to some people going hungry, and that is an intolerable evil. However, whenever value questions are reasoned about, some value has to be taken for granted and used in determining the conclusion drawn. People may not be able to agree on common ultimate value commitments. However, they would be able to do so to a much greater extent if all kinds of particular values, such as avoiding pork, were not instilled or taught as intrinsic but were presented as secondary, subsidiary derived rules. In any event, after having had the experience of wrestling with arguments for and against utilitarianism, we should have no difficulty in agreeing with Mill when he says, on page 4, that the issue can be approached rationally, though not necessarily from a ground common to everyone. I will now begin my examination of Chapter 2, What Utilitarianism Is. The chapter begins satisfactorily enough with the point that, etymology notwithstanding, utilitarianism is to be understood on the basis of the concepts pleasure and pain, not on the basis of the concept of usefulness. An exact definition of the word utilitarianism is not given, but the second paragraph in the chapter comes close to doing so. After this, however, comes the first in a series of misinterpretations of utilitarianism which are more than sufficient to confuse the unwary reader and divert him or her from the utilitarian path. In the guise of a defender of utilitarianism, against the objection that there are higher ends than pleasure, Mill says human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. It is one thing to say that utilitarianism does not reduce people to the level of swine, because people can experience pleasures in ways which swine cannot. But it is a distortion of the concept of happiness to assert that it does not apply unless the human faculties are more elevated than the animal appetites have been gratified, as Mill says. We apply the concept of happiness when the amount of various pleasures is sufficiently large and the amount of various pains is sufficiently small, without regard to the sources of the pleasures. Euphoric persons are deemed happy irrespective of the source of their euphoria. Next, on page 5, Mill asserts without any justification that utilitarianism has many Stoic and Christian implications. He no doubt expects this, and much else, to be accepted on the basis of an appeal to authority that he is an expert utilitarian. But it is by no means clear which elements of Stoicism and Christianity are supposed to be implied, and the only effect of such a pronouncement can be to create uncertainty or confusion in the reader's mind. The sabotage is quickly compounded when Mill falsely asserts on page 6 that it is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It is one thing to realize that there is a difficulty in adding quantities of different kinds of pleasure, but it is another matter to rank pleasures on the basis of their type. The utilitarian has to decide, for example, how much of the pleasure derivable from tickling is an equal amount to the given amount of pleasure derivable from solving a philosophical problem. But once that is done, it can be said that in itself, a given quantity of pleasure from the tickling is as welcome to the utilitarian as an equal quantity of pleasure from solving the philosophical problem. Mill also talks of distinguishing a qualitatively superior pleasure from another one, on the basis that people who have experienced the pleasures in question prefer the qualitatively superior one, even though knowing it has to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of other pleasure which their nature is capable of. Such an attitude to different kinds of pleasure is not only anti-utilitarian, it also fails to leave us with a properly worked out alternative to utilitarianism. Mill says a being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points, than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what feels like to be a lower grade of existence. If we suppose, as Mill does, that a person is capable of experiencing pleasures, as well as pains, which a pig is incapable of experiencing, then a utilitarian would prefer a human mode of existence if this permitted more happiness than a pig could experience. On the other hand, the utilitarian would object to the inclusion of the word never in Mill's pronouncement, since the utilitarian would indeed prefer a lower grade of existence if this were necessary for a greater happiness than could have in fact been achieved otherwise. Mill's exercise culminates on page 7 of the PDF file I'm using in the famous pronouncement, strongly anti-utilitarian in essence: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Mill has thus used one of the most powerful arguments against utilitarianism, not in order to argue straightforwardly against utilitarianism, but in order to confuse the reader about what utilitarianism is, by claiming that the anti-utilitarian position can be accommodated within utilitarianism. In the course of singing the praises of higher pleasures, Mill does a further disservice to utilitarianism, and indeed to people in general, when he asserts that the higher and lower pleasures cannot be combined. Writing within the Victorian tradition, Mill says many in all ages have broken down in an ineffectual attempt to combine both. Here Mill is misleading the reader, and in this instance probably himself as well, by giving radically bad advice on the means to happiness. Normally neglect of those areas of life which are conducive to the lower pleasures is quite sufficient to produce unhappiness break down. Mill's own life certainly illustrates this truth. As a Victorian intellectual, he was no doubt a victim of conditioning designed to lead him to violate his nature and convert himself into a highly productive and effective intellectual machine. Next, Mill returns to his tactic of considering objections to utilitarianism and using them against utilitarianism while pretending to defend it. He mentions Carlyle, reporting that he maintains that happiness is unattainable and is something one has no right to, on page 8 of the PDF. Mill and Carlyle represent contrasting types of propagandist. Carlyle defends the capitalists against the people they are exploiting by bluntly telling the people their aspirations cannot, should not, and certainly will not be met. Mill pretends to side with the people, and then uses the people's confidence in him to cheat them by spinning a complex web of propaganda in which the unwary reader will only get lost. Here Mill gives a false impression that utilitarians have advocated aiming for a specific low level of happiness, rather than as much happiness as possible. A utilitarian is not called upon to state what amount of happiness that could be attained is. No one knows that. Mill is in no position to forecast how much happiness could be attained in a society organized to maximize happiness than in societies organized for different ends. But Mill would clearly like to have us believe that we could not attain much more happiness than we already are attaining. He thus strives to undermine the will to organize a utilitarian society. Why make it an effort if it would not establish that much difference? He is trading on the potential ambivalence of the potential utilitarian. On the one hand, he or she wants as much happiness as possible. On the other hand, he or she may be reluctant to oppose the existing social order with all that such opposition entails. How tempting then to believe that utilitarianism has effectively already been implemented, or that utilitarianism can be done within the capitalist order. Indeed, Mill goes on to say, on page 12, that many have already achieved as much happiness as can be by an individual, and that the present wretched education and wretched social arrangements are the only real hindrance to its being attainable by almost all. The meaning of the term social arrangements is unclear, but the general tendency of the writing is towards relative social complacency. In Victorian England, utilitarianism was a politically significant movement. Repression had been used to contain the utilitarian movement, which was inspired by world-famous leaders such as Robert Owen, originally an industrial capitalist who, like the classical socialist Engels, did not really wish to act on the capitalist principle and sought scope in his life for collectivistic action. Initially, Owen concentrated on running his factory in a way that took the employees' happiness into account at the expense of profit, but he realized that there was no reason to stop at his own employees, or to maintain their status as employees, and this led to social experiments and to politics. Mill is offering an alternative or complement to repression of utilitarianism. On page 12 of the PDF, he muses that utilitarianism is too high a standard for humanity, and objectors may perhaps be justifiably doubting whether human beings, if taught to consider happiness as an end of life, should be satisfied with such a moderate share of it. Not such a loyal defender of utilitarianism, Mill is, but great numbers of mankind have been satisfied with much less, he continues. In other words, Mill is confident that if people were told, say by a political leader, that they should pursue and be led to maximal happiness, then they should be willing to accept the assurance that they had reached that goal, even if they were not very happy, and even if virtually no steps have been taken in the sphere of socialization and social organization to pursue the general happiness. Since utilitarianism has not found political expression in the way that socialism has, we have been denied the experience of pseudo-utilitarian politicians telling the electorate that the general happiness has been made as great as it could possibly be by measures which we do not differ in reality from those which could have been instituted by politicians who are overtly mere agents of the capitalists. Mill's confidence in the possibility of such swindle has, however, been well justified by the success of pseudo-socialist politicians in convincing the electorate, to some extent, that the general interest has been served to the highest possible degree by measures from which the capitalists employ any way in order to bind the people of the first world to them. Affluence, a demeaning social safety net, and etc. The two key elements in Mill's swindle should be noted carefully, as should their mode of interaction. One line of propaganda assures the reader, or listener, that the writer, or speaker, is on the side of those who desire happiness, or democracy, and etc. A great show of support is put on, to make the assurance seem convincing. The other line of propaganda cautions against expecting too much. This plays ultimately on a natural fear of repression, as well as on the carefully nurtured respect in which the propagandist enjoys. Once the reader, or listener, accepts the idea that really nothing is going to change in any way, he or she is grateful to be offered a vehicle which offers the pretense of pursuing his or her original ideal. His or her situation becomes similar to that of a person whose original natural desire for immortality is met not by a capitalistically justifiable program of scientific research, but rather by a church. Before renewing his sabotage of utilitarianism, Mill makes the correct point that self-sacrifice is warranted for the utilitarian, not as an end in itself, but only if it is conducive to maximizing the general happiness. He also asserts incorrectly that all heroes and martyrs have sacrificed themselves for the sake of the general happiness. This is obviously false on any normal interpretation of the word happiness, and also it should be noted that heroes and martyrs have not all been utilitarians. But then it is in Mill's aim to confuse people about the meaning of the word happiness in the utilitarian context, to hijack and merge utilitarianism with non-utilitarian positions, and to leave the would-be utilitarian reader with an empty shell. If he is getting successful in this, then Mill should have no more difficulty in getting the reader to agree that all heroes and martyrs have been utilitarians than, say, a journalist has in getting people to agree that Australia is a capitalist country which sometimes has a socialist government. As the reference to martyrs might have led one to expect, Mill's next move is to confuse utilitarianism with Christianity. He says, "In the Golden Rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. In terms of its literal content, the Golden Rule would lead a person to strive to maximize the general happiness if and only if he or she wanted to want above all else that other people would strive to maximize his or her own happiness. Such is not necessarily the case. However, the literal content of the Golden Rule is less important than its role and its interpretation that it acquires in the feudal and capitalist societies in which it is enunciated. The Golden Rule does not inspire many people to a collectivistic philosophy of life. It is interpreted to enjoin charitable behavior within the context of a fundamentally individualistic society. In acting individualistically, people do harm to one another, and the Golden Rule and other elements of Christianity are generally applied to take the edge off some of the harm. A destitute person may be given food, and a redundant worker may hear words of thanks for past services. But there is no tendency on the part of most Christians to strive to organize a society to avoid the destitution and redundancy and etc., which are presupposed and taken for granted, even though it is not organizationally difficult to avoid them, given the will in those who hold power. It would be easy for the government to provide meaningful work such as landscaping, extra teachers for smaller classes, additional researchers on important matters, and etc., to convert Social Security payments into wages. So in equating utilitarianism with Christianity, Mill has found another way to diffuse utilitarianism and to make it toothless and adjunct of individualism. Immediately after having wrongly equated utilitarianism with the Golden Rule, which is uttered unspecifically about what goals to pursue, Mill proposes substituting the word interest for the word happiness in the context of utilitarianism. He does this in a characteristic formulation containing the word or, the happiness, or, as speaking practically it would be called, the interest of every individual. The word happiness is descriptive and relatively precise in its standard utilitarian use. The word interest is very vague, and all kinds of things in addition to happiness come to be regarded as people's interest. What is practical about replacing the word happiness, not by a definition, ostensibly the subject of the chapter, but by a vaguer term? It is a very practical step in the further evisceration of utilitarianism. It paves the way for the insertion of goals other than happiness, including the goals which are incompatible with maximal happiness, or even a modicum of happiness for some. This step is taken at the point at which Mill returns to the key question of the social arrangements which are appropriate to the implementation of utilitarianism. Thus he returns to this question after just having equated utilitarianism with the Christian Golden Rule. We know what most Christians understand the social implications of their doctrine to be. Mill's formulation of social implications of utilitarianism is as follows. Laws and social arrangements should place the happiness, or, as speaking practically it may be called, the interest of every individual, as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole. This can be found on page 12 of the PDF. Contrast this formulation with the following correct one. Society should be organized so that individuals do not jeopardize the maximization of the general happiness. That is the correct utilitarian interpretation of how society should be arranged. Mill's dropping of the word happiness in favor of the word interest, in his total elimination of the concept of the maximization, for his use of a well-worn metaphor of harmony, results in a pallid formulation which, to say the least, gives no clear indication of the social organization appropriate to utilitarianism. Mill goes on to advocate establishing in the mind of every individual an unbreakable association between his own happiness and the good of the whole. However, such a conviction would be of no use in the absence of a clear conception of the good and the whole, and an accurate idea of what steps are actually appropriate towards maximizing the general happiness. Mill is doing his utmost to ensure the absence of both of these, leaving the reader open to all kinds of manipulation based on the assurance that what he or she is being led to do is for the good of the whole, and hence for his or her good as well. Mill loses no time in taking specific steps to forestall effective steps to implementing utilitarianism. Responding to the objection that it is exacting too much to require that people shall always act from the inducement of promoting the general interests of society, he first makes the correct point that the objection confuses the rule of action with the motive of it. A collectivist may be selfish in his or her motive for being a collectivist, and a rule of conduct can be implemented through organizational steps which do not require the same motivation or forethought from all of the participants. But Mill, of course, fails to make clear that a utilitarian would be released from the burden of personally making the utilitarian calculations only after establishment of a utilitarian society which would organize people's behavior along utilitarian lines. To say, as Mill does, that it is a misapprehension of the utilitarian mode of thought to conceive of it as implying that people should fix their minds on so wide a generality as the world is to urge a position which, if accepted, would ensure that no steps were taken to establish utilitarian society. Even after a utilitarian society was established, it would be desirable for everyone to think in terms of the general happiness during policymaking, including policymaking at the individual level. Mill's effort to radically distort the content of utilitarianism is redoubled in Chapter 4. There is little further to object to in Chapter 2. He mentions certain objections to utilitarianism, that it makes men cold, that it is godless, that there is not time prior to action to make the necessary calculations, and etc., and he handles them correctly by pointing out that if such objections refuted utilitarianism, then they would refute any moral principle whatsoever. For the objections apply equally to all moral principles, and this can be found on pages 18 to 24 of the book. Thus, a pattern begins to emerge. Mill alternates between sound thinking about utilitarianism and sabotage of utilitarianism. These batches of sound thinking give him overall credibility which he needs to practice his brand of sabotage. Examination of Chapter 3, of the ultimate sanctions of the principle of utility. There isn't really a whole lot of worthwhile materials to discuss in this chapter, of the kind that I have not already talked about so far in this video. In this chapter, Mill proceeds in the following way. Viewing utilitarianism as a moral principle, Mill identifies various sanctions which might be used to enforce it. They include fear or love of God, hope for God's favor, fear or love of some other people, and hope for favor from other people, pain of conscience, and social feelings. Mill is of course right in saying that these sanctions should be deployed in the service of utilitarianism just as they are deployable, and deployed, in relation to other principles. But we also know that morality, which in practice is always collectivistic in its content, takes second place to individualistic philosophies of life in individualistic societies. Events dictated by individualism and morality is violated. This would be true of utilitarianism if it had merely the status of a moral principle in an individualistic society. The array of sanctions listed by Mill would not alter the situation, even if they were all deployed in support of utilitarianism, for they already prove ineffective in relation to other moral principles. Thus, the main significance of Chapter 3 lies in what it does not include, namely mentioning the organization of society on the basis of the utilitarian principle. Then the sanctions would include laws and guns and etc. Organization would then lead people along the utilitarian path, and people could have a utilitarian philosophy of life rather than a mere utilitarian morality. An examination of Chapter 4, of what sort of proof the principle of utility is susceptible. Instead of offering powerful arguments for utilitarianism, arguments like the ones we have already considered, which might really turn a person into a utilitarian, Mill offers a strange, unconvincing, and invalid argument. To appreciate the depth of his sabotage, one must bear in mind what is not included in the chapter, as well as the discouraging material which he does include. First, Mill invites us to accept the argument from the premise, happiness is desired, to the conclusion, happiness is desirable. However, the argument pattern, X is desired, so X is desirable, is not valid, as it contains an error in logic. Consider the case where X is some harmful thing, which is desired. Then the premise will be true, but the conclusion will be unacceptable. Mill draws an analogy with the argument pattern, X is heard, so X is audible, on page 32 of the book. But the analogy is faulty. X is heard does indeed establish that X is audible, or capable of being heard. X is desirable establishes that X is capable of being desired, but this is not what X is desirable normally means, and not what it means to be relevant to utilitarianism. Audible is a descriptive term, and desirable is prescriptive, or expressive and evaluative judgment. Mill realizes that even if he had demonstrated that happiness is desirable, this would still fall short from establishing the acceptability of utilitarianism. To narrow the gap, he proposes to try to show that only happiness is desired on page 33 of his book. Of course, the inference from only X is desired to only X is desirable is also invalid, and counterexamples are very easy to find. But setting the goal of establishing that only happiness is desired serves Mill as a pretext for embarking upon the systematic confusion of happiness with everything else that anybody had ever desired. Thus, not only does Mill pour cold water on utilitarianism by arguing for it in a way which no one could ever take seriously, I mean, just try to imagine using these arguments on a man in the street. In addition, he continues his campaign to destroy the reader's conceptual grip on utilitarianism. Mill then admits that people do desire things which, in common language, are decidedly distinguished from happiness. Is there, then, something wrong with ordinary usage? Is it wrong to say that the words money and happiness, for example, express different concepts and also apply to different things? The meaning of the word money is such that it does not apply to a feeling, whereas the word happiness does. Even when people desire money only because they believe it will bring them pleasure, they still do desire money, which is distinct from any pleasure it might bring. And so Mill is deprived of his premise that it is only happiness that is desired. Mill has given notice that he is going to depart from common language, but no such departure can alter the basic fact that we desire things other than happiness. As we shall see, his departures from common language will actually consist in a monstrous series of confusions. Mill could have argued more plausibly, though still not correctly, that the only thing desired as an ultimate end is happiness, but this would have restricted the scope of his exercise in creating the confusion. On the same page in this chapter, Mill considers the desire for virtue and conflates utilitarianism with a virtue ethics-based moral theory. He is right in saying that utilitarians agree that people desire virtue, and that it is something to be desired. In saying the latter, the utilitarian will be using the word virtue with utilitarian criteria of virtue in mind. However, Mill next claims that the utilitarian end will be better served if people desire virtue for its own sake, not just insofar as it is conducive to the maximization of general happiness. This is arguable from an elitist point of view in relation to some people, but if this position is applied to everyone, then it leads to the paradox that the utilitarian path could not be regained if it was discovered that pursuing utilitarian virtue is counterproductive to maximizing the pleasure and minimizing the pain. Yet it is precisely people like Mill who would have us believe that the best way to implement utilitarianism is to found a society on a quite different principle, namely capitalism. How, it may be asked, can Mill maintain that people desire only happiness when he has insisted that people can and do and should desire virtue for its own sake, and when it has really no relationship to happiness, either in their minds or in reality? Displaying an astonishing and bewildering capacity for confusion, Mill says in the very next breath that virtue is one of the ingredients of happiness, and that, like ingredients, it is desirable in itself, and not merely when considered as swelling in aggregate. This is taken from page 33 of Mill's book. Of ingredients of happiness in general, Mill says that besides being the means, they are also part of the end, and that's at the end of page 34. The word ingredient is a metaphor. Let's just pause for a moment here and seriously consider the implications of what Mill is suggesting. We cannot take seriously the idea that virtue and money are parts of the feeling of happiness in the way in which flour is part of a cake. The only sense we can make of this notion of an ingredient of happiness is in terms of as a means to happiness. Nothing could sabotage the pursuit of happiness more effectively than confusion of means and end. In saying that means, as an ingredient, is desirable in itself, Mill is getting the reader to desire things which are sometimes appropriate to the utilitarian end and sometimes are not, depending on the circumstances. The whole point of the distinction between the means and end is to maintain caution in relation to things which should be desired only when it is established that they do have an end in happiness for the greatest number of people. Mill furthers his aim, introducing confusion of means and end by taking advantage of the turn of phrase, music is a pleasure. We mean by this, of course, that music is a source of pleasure. not the word music designates a type of pleasure sensation. Mill takes advantage of the phraseology to insist, in the name of utilitarianism, that music is not to be looked upon as a means to a collective of something termed happiness, and to be desired of that account. If music in general is an ingredient of happiness, then according to Mill, music is desirable in itself. But of course, much music is highly undesirable from a utilitarian point of view, among others. If we develop and hear music indiscriminately, then we will certainly not reach the utilitarian end. Not only will some music be unpleasant in itself, some music which is pleasant in itself may be used to painful effect, as when a pleasant tune is used to march soldiers off to their death. This could not be prevented if, as Mill insists, music is to be considered desirable independently of its relationship to the general happiness. In this final chapter, Mill also notes that virtue is not the only thing originally a means, and which, if it were not a means to anything else, would be and remain indifferent, but which by association with what it is a means to, comes to be desired for itself, and that too with utmost intensity. This is a wise observation, but its purpose, in Mill's book, is not to serve as a warning against falling into the trap that he describes. Rather, he wants to push the reader into the trap. He takes the example of money, which is certainly a most important one, in view as what has happened to mankind since money was invented. Mill accurately describes the way money has come to be desired as an end in itself, as a result of its usefulness within certain social systems. Caveman would have had no great interest in it. Then, instead of warning a person, or people in general, that they might become less than maximally happy through the indiscriminate pursuit of money, he says that money, and power and fame, have become a part of the end, and a more important part of it than any of the other things that they are means to. This is also in page 34 of the book. Writing of money, he says, the desire of it is not a different thing from the desire of happiness any more than the love of music or the desire of health. They are included in happiness. They are some of the elements of which the desire of happiness is made up. Happiness is not an abstract idea, but a concrete whole, he proclaims, and these are some of its parts. In other words, the sad millionaire may really be happier than the merry shepherd because he has so much more money, fame, power, and etc. That really doesn't make sense. Having perpetrated this outrage on utilitarianism, and in the final analysis on all people, not just utilitarians, Mill then assumes the reader that the utilitarian standard sanctions and approves money and etc. as being parts of the concrete whole of happiness. To reinforce his point, Mill continues, saying that life would be a poor thing, very ill provided with sources of happiness, if there were not this provision of nature, by which things originally indifferent, but conductive to, or otherwise associated with, the satisfaction of our primitive desires, become in themselves sources of pleasure more valuable than primitive pleasures. Here Mill is distracting and confusing the reader by raising what is in fact a different issue, namely, whether satisfaction of acquired desires is more pleasurable than satisfaction of innate or primitive desires. It is true that the realization of any desire tends to be pleasant in some degree, but of course in many cases the pain caused to oneself or others far outweighs the pleasure, and this provides no excuse from a utilitarian point of view for regarding everything we desire, or everything we could desire, as desirable. Our deepest pleasure will in fact come from satisfying our innate desires, and it will be magnified only a little by the pleasure of succeeding in taking the steps along the way. In the word primitive, Mill is conjuring with the prejudices of a Victorian Christianity in an effort to woo the reader into preoccupation with civilized objectives like earning money, which will then be used to manipulate people into such less than perfectly blissful activities, such as fighting in the colonial and world wars. Recall that in Chapter 2, Mill said that the average person would not be called upon to think in terms of the general interests, but would be left to pursue their own private interests. It should also be noticed when reading Mill that when Mill says that the utilitarian standard tolerates and approves those other acquired desires, up to the point beyond which they would have been more injurious to the general happiness than promotive of it, that he is advocating a weaker condition for approving acquiring desires then is consistent with utilitarianism, which requires that one disapprove of any desire which is not maximally conducive to the general happiness. Mill ends the chapter by first insisting that his contention that other things desired are parts of the happiness proves that there is, in reality, nothing desired except happiness. Of course, his proof is sheer nonsense. Then, however, he goes on to insist that we must consult our experience to determine whether we ever desire anything except happiness, and things we believe to be means to happiness. If we do this, and consider examples like the desire to continue living in the face of agony, and the desire for knowledge that is depressing, we may be less confident than Mill of an affirmative answer. In addition, Mill suggests it is true by definition that we desire that we find what we find pleasant, but it is in fact that there is no contradiction in saying that X is desired but is not found pleasant. In any case, utilitarian view is not that we do ultimately desire nothing but happiness, but rather that we should simultaneously desire nothing but happiness. The utilitarian would be ill-advised to try and base the second of these views on the first. Indeed, if it were true that we never ultimately desired anything but happiness, then there would be no need to argue the matter at all. But it is not true, and so the case for utilitarianism lies elsewhere. Mill does not even begin to present it. On the contrary, he does all he can do to obscure every view he claims to be anxious to support. Examination of Chapter 5, on the connection between justice and utility. This last chapter is of very little value. After spending a great deal of time discussing justice as such, Mill arbitrarily declares that a commitment to just distribution is involved in the very meaning of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, which he now refers to as the same thing. Mill did not give a very precise formulation of the principle, but there is nothing in his formulations, or other standard formulations of the basic position, which implies that the happiness of each individual is to be safeguarded, or which tells us how to balance the happiness of the individual against the total happiness of the society. A definite modification of utilitarianism is needed if sacrifice of the individual is to be ruled out. Mill says that the utilitarian will insist that one person's happiness is counted for exactly as much as another's, no doubt, but in which sum? Mill's language is in fact ambiguous. He might mean one person's contribution to the sum of the total is as good as an equal contribution of another, or he might just mean that no one's happiness will be neglected. The first interpretation fails to address the issue of justice, whilst the second one does so, but is not part and parcel of utilitarianism. So Mill ends the book by putting on a great show of defending utilitarianism in one of its least defensible aspects. Such a loyal defender. I hope you enjoyed this critical examination and historical context of Mill's utilitarianism. Stay tuned for more videos where I criticize philosophy on the basis of the corrupt, prevailing political agenda.